Recording in progress.
Okay, so we're going to jump back into this series that I've called Centered. It's ultimately a series on doctrine and beliefs and convictions. And so we've been making our way topically through a number of different areas. And we're going to spend a few Sundays on the area of worship, doctrines and convictions about worship. Good morning, Jane.
Good morning. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
So I recognize this is a difficult question to jump into off the bat here, but I have high faith in you. What is biblical worship? What is normal worship? What beliefs, convictions have churches had about worship that you've been a part of? There are no wrong answers here. This is just to sort of get us thinking about worship and doctrine. What's biblical? What's normal? What convictions have been a part of the churches that you've been a part of in your life? Aaron.
I've got a question. I don't know about a cornucopia, but I've got three traditions so far, and I'm hoping not to get a fourth. But growing up in the Catholic Church, worship was done out of a book, and it wasn't this book. The book in the pew. You knew every week what you were going to do, what you were going to say, and whether or not you were going to sing. So, and from that, I went sort of the complete other way. Some friends of mine who I played Dungeons and Dragons with went to a Baptist church, and at least we were looking at this book, you know. But it was. I mean, they had instruments. There were Bible verses. There was an actual Bible study. You know, none of that. All of this was brand new to me. And then Anna and I met, and I started coming here, and what surprised me most was the lack of instruments. But it was like, okay, well, you know, at least y'all know how to sing. But it was more, the closer it gets to focusing on what's in the Bible, to me, that to me is, well, that would be biblical, obviously.
Okay.
Those are the traditions I've been through, and I don't know that there is such a difference between biblical and normal. So I don't know what normal worship is.
Okay. Maybe abnormal. Okay, others. Go ahead, Sheldon, then Art.
It seems to me that a big part of the biblical worship is communion, having communion, and commemorating the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord. And I've been in worship service before, that's not part of the worship service. Then they do it once every couple of weeks or once a month. To me, that's a very important one.
Okay, yeah. So a particular practice, communion, the Eucharist, being a central practice for worship. Yeah, Art.
I was to say on the biblical worship, I think it's the gathering together. There's a lot being said about more than one gathering together to worship. So I think that's biblical worship. In terms of normal worship, and I say this in a way that's complementary, at least meant to be, but it's somewhat rote in terms of the hour, let's say the worship hour, in terms of how things proceed. And so it seems to be normal to have it go that way. So those would be like the subtle differences.
Okay. Yeah, and when Scripture talks about worship, sometimes it uses language that makes us think of a way of life, a lifestyle of worship. But then other times it's leading us to think about this gathering. So worship becomes synonymous with something that we do together with other people. Good. Guy.
Normal worship, I think it's whatever form of worship the person can do trying to find the right word, but what I find is sometimes I like reflecting, quiet, listen, reflecting on what's been said, and reflecting on my relationship with God. When I'm in church, that's how I find myself. But sometimes I will go to certain churches where it's raised, and I can see those people are really into it. So it's not my place to say their form of worship is wrong, mine is right. So there are a form of worship that are more expressive and some are more reflective. And
Okay.
I find myself in the reflective category.
Yeah. Yeah. So very broadly speaking, there are some forms of worship and some traditions that are expressive in their worship and some that are more contemplative or reflective in their worship. And you resonate more with the reflective style there.
Jane.
Oh, Jane,
Your
yes.
computer.
Thank you.
I worked years ago with college students, and one has to make things pretty simple for college students. And we came up with a working definition, which I still think is rather good. Worship is anything and everything that we do to orchestrate our attention on God, to pay attention to God. It may be sitting in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, looking up at the walls of the canyon. It may be walking the streets of Lower Manhattan, looking up at the structures. It may be a rock band in a, I mean, it to start to identify what it is to create really an endless list, because there are endless numbers of human beings. But I think it's safe to say, and so I think when we look at our corporate worship, and I would distinguish too between corporate worship and private or personal worship.
Okay.
And those may overlap in a lot of ways, and they may diverge in some significant ways. But I really have always liked that orchestrating, and I like the image of an orchestra, you know,
Mhm.
being pulled together and to orchestrate our attention on God, to pay attention to God. That's,
Nice. Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Jane.
mhm.
Okay. So basically, I only have two things that I'd really like to get across today. And there's a lot about worship to talk about. So we will continue to talk about worship beyond today. But one of those things is this, that doctrines about worship, especially within churches of Christ, function largely as boundary beliefs and corresponding practices that prove that a certain congregation is biblical or faithful or not biblical or unfaithful. And that's a broad brush. I think generally it's true that in our tradition, as we've written and debated and preached about worship, it's largely been under this function of boundary beliefs. And I would suggest that's been very much to our detriment, and it resulted in a less than robust view of worship, both private and corporate worship. Now, we are eventually going to talk about instruments. Okay, my intent is not to talk about them today. However, to illustrate this broad point here, I have a couple of examples regarding instrumental worship, because again, this is one of the very few things that churches of Christ have actually talked about when it comes to worship. So these couple of examples here are illustrative not permissive for us to talk about instrumental worship yet. We'll talk about that maybe next Sunday. Okay. But we're getting around the edges of it this morning. Okay. So notice this. So this is on the handout. And Jane, if you just listen to these two quotes here. So Jack Lewis has a fairly widely read summary of worship in churches of Christ, in which he sort of summarizes how one particular doctrine about worship, instrumental music, became the boundary doctrine. So he says, in congregation after congregation, division arose and bitterness grew over the introduction of the instrument, whether those favoring the practice were in the minority or the majority. In many cases, those opposing instrumental music and worship had to withdraw from the congregation. So you see the boundary language that's being used there. So he looks back sort of over the sweep, our own history, and this particular worship issue, he describes it largely in terms of a boundary. It's people are withdrawing from congregations, they're dividing, there's bitterness over it. He goes on to show how the introduction of the instrument was largely viewed as a litmus test for larger biblical obedience. So one of the reasons it gained such robust conversation was that it was more than just the issue. Your perspective on this issue was a litmus test for your perspective on the whole Bible. If you were wrong on this, you were wrong on everything. And if you were right on this, you were right on everything. So he says, from the beginning, a cappella congregations have seen the use of musical instruments in worship to be a leak in the dike of biblical authority. You let that little thing leak and the whole dike's gonna go, right? Tolbert Fanning, he says, wrote in 1856, we regard the organ and violin worship. We don't see a lot of that. And even the fashionable choir singing of our country as mockery of all that is sacred. Mockery of all that is sacred. So it's a boundary issue. And being on the wrong side of this issue puts you on the wrong side of the only boundary that matters. Faithful, unfaithful, heaven, hell, biblical, unbiblical. It's all wrapped up, right, in that one issue. Another example. In a 1927 debate on instrumental music between H. Leo Bowles, who was then president of David Lipscomb College, now Lipscomb University in Nashville, associated with Churches of Christ, and M.D. Clubb, secretary of the Tennessee Christian Missionary Society. And you can pull this up online. You can read the entire debate, hundreds of pages around this particular issue. So Clubb opens up the written portion of this debate. He opens it up in these words. At the beginning of this discussion, which is to appear simultaneously in the Gospel Advocate and the Christian Evangelist, I suppose a word of explanation would be in order. The discussion grows out of conditions which are peculiar almost entirely to the South. The music question is of no concern whatever in any other religious body except our own. And with the great mass of our people, it is, as it should be, a dead issue. Professor McGarvey was asked a short time before his death what he then thought of the question as it affected our people. And he answered, the churches have settled it. Here is a custom which is well nigh universally practiced by Christians of our time, and not one word of objection is raised against it, except by a small group of Christians here in the South. This incontrovertible fact should have some weight with these brethren. But for us in the South, it has been and still is a fruitful source of weakness, humiliation, and reproach. We would have been a great, influential body of people in the South today, had it not been for the unseemly strife and alienation which the long agitation of this and one other question has produced. Our plea for the unity of all Christians has been nullified by our own division. For how can a people plead for unity where they themselves are not practicing it? Our conservative brethren have made two things tests of fellowship: organized missionary work and instrumental music in worship. Opposition to these has led them to separate from us and form another religious body. But I still regard them as my brethren and hope someday the breach will be healed. Boundary language, through and through, right? Obviously, he's arguing on the side of instrumental worship. H. Leo Bull's arguing against it. Notice his language there. He claims that this is an issue of no concern whatever in any other religious body except our own. So how does a worship doctrine, a worship conviction, a worship belief become that significant when so many others give it no weight at all? What, Scott?
Well, he mentioned South several times. We should be clear. This is all about civil. Yeah.
Okay.
All of it is. And it's about identity of Southern Christians, to keep your identity as Southern Christians with some simple one word that would give you a clue about who was in, who was out. And that was instrumental music, or I should say instrumental music and missionary society work. And when you go, we would go on tours from Harding University, on choral tours all over the Midwest and the Northeast. And you would have thought that all of those churches of Christ that had instruments did not exist. That we haven't talked about, that we haven't referenced. We went to these isolated little instrumental churches in the Midwest and in the Northeast, and we did our concerts there. And you would never know that this is all about fear and all about people that were not a part of this sound.
Okay, so let's I see these two hands here. So let's just notice the argument that Scott's making more broadly, and it's the idea that even deeply held convictions about worship may be rooted more in historical, cultural issues and perspectives than perhaps in Scripture itself, right? So Dale's hand went up, and then Aaron's hand. So Dale.
Yeah, Scott probably said it more than well enough, but emphasize that point. The American Christian Missionary Society, founded by Alexander Campbell, in the middle of the Civil War, endorses the North. South immediately has, not that they didn't have this before, but they immediately had scriptural objections, biblical objections to missionary societies, which they did not have before. But when the missionary society endorsed the North, that it's the same, and then it's the same group of people, instrumental music, missionary societies, that's a whole set of innovations that come from the North, and to give into them are like giving into the Civil War victories they can, and we're not doing it. And then some rather sketchy biblical arguments made. I was going to say, how does worship doctrine of no concern about become a boundary belief? Well, when biblical worship becomes worship of the Bible, that was going to be my first reaction to the first question you put up. I suppose biblical worship is worship of the Bible. No one actually says that, but that is actually what happened. I mean, you find a proof text, you take it out of context, but it's in the Bible.
Mhm.
So, you know, that's worshiping a text
Mhm.
and not God. I mean, having said that, you know, the Bible is guiding and authoritative for me, but it's what is going on in the Bible? What's the context?
Mhm.
What's the living context there? Anyway, that's from a historical standpoint, it was so obvious
Mhm.
this was a cultural argument, just like right now, the homophobic arguments are cultural arguments.
Mhm.
The scripture grants substantial freedom. And the people who claim others are giving into culture are in fact the ones who are arguing on the basis. They don't know it, but they're arguing on the basis of culture because they don't have a scriptural argument.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Aaron?
Well, probably correlating with that is the whole concept of I've heard this in this church from an elder about the church at first. Now, I love that phrase because it really wasn't a church technically at first, having no music. Well, they didn't have no music because if they were playing cymbals and tambourines and wonderful things like this, the Roman soldiers would have come in and executed them.
Hmm.
That's why they had no music in the church at first.
Hmm.
So, I mean, it's just as relatively weak an argument as instrumental music. I mean, as the mission, anti-North thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, because first time I heard that, I went, do you remember the Roman persecution at all? Jesus, the Romans, they kind of nailed him to a cross. Does anyone remember that? The Romans were persecuting the church. Paul, our great first saint, the first real conversion, is a persecutor of the church. So that's why there was no instrumental music. You're trying not to draw attention to yourself because you'll be killed. Now, if there were people out there trying to kill us now, we wouldn't be meeting in a big building like this. We'd be meeting in somebody's house, probably in the basement, being really, really quiet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there are historical and cultural considerations behind the practices of the first church, the early church. Are those historical and cultural conditions the same today, and thus requiring the same kind of practices? Those are the kinds of questions that we have to ask ourselves. So again, what I'm trying to lead us to think about is how we think about worship convictions and doctrine, and that we've tended to think about them largely as boundaries. So Charles is just about to raise his hand, and then Rosemary.
You're good. Yeah. One of the, at least in my experience, it's all I can speak about. It's where I see this being really a problem is when people are converted to a non-instrumental approach. In other words, when maybe they aren't Christian, or maybe they're not, have a faith to start with, but then someone comes along and convinces them that this is what it's really about, right? And worship in this way and go to this church and do these things. And so that becomes where their convictions are centered. It's not in Christ, but it's in this other set of siblings. And when someone's converted to that and becomes a part of their identity and responsibility, then that's where I think it gains a root that's really problematic. Because they are not messing, you're not really talking about anything. You're talking about somebody's salvation of their identity.
Yeah.
Right. That becomes something that's a very different kind of argument.
Right. Yeah. Which then becomes formative in the way they look at scripture and God and yeah. Okay. Thank you. Rosemary.
I can introduce another boundary belief, not so familiar in the North. I grew up in the tradition of one cup of communion.
Okay. Yeah.
Which was very divisive. And Scott talking about a list of churches with instruments. There was a book published of churches with one cup communion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a number of these increasingly, I can't think of a good way to say that, but a number of issues that become boundary markers around worship, which then really minimize our view of worship and what Scripture has to say about worship. Okay, so what the other thing that I'd like you to walk away with is so one, in what ways has sort of a boundary perspective governed the way that we tend to think about worship? Then, so this is the second point here, okay? But rather than worship doctrines being boundary based, what if we considered them as centering or decentering? As we continue to think about doctrine as a set of beliefs or convictions that move us toward the center being love of God and love of neighbor, we ask now about worship, what worship doctrines and practices might be particularly centering. So rather than considering will this doctrine or this worship practice get us in or keep us out, the question becomes, will this practice or this doctrine help us move toward the center of loving God and loving neighbor? And if the answer to that is yes, then perhaps it's a good conviction or a good practice to have. If the answer to that is no, then perhaps it's not a conviction or a practice at least worth fighting over, right? And so what I want to suggest, and I'm trying to suggest in this whole series, is that the ability of a particular practice or doctrine to move us corporately and individually toward the center of loving God and loving neighbor, that's what matters. That's what matters. And that this can be, I think, quite informative as we begin to think then about worship. So for example, I think there are a number of texts that we might look at, and we'll look at some more that we might think of as sort of centering texts when it comes to worship. But I really like this one, and I think maybe this is a good one to start with, because it's one of the last texts about worship. And in some ways, we might see much of what the Bible has to say about worship is all sort of pointing in this direction. You know, it's all leading in this direction. So Revelation 7, verse 9. After this, I looked, and there was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, robed in white, with palm branches in their hands. It's Palm Sunday. It's kind of nice. They cried out in a loud voice, saying, "Salvation belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb." So just a few notes about this and its placement in Revelation. Chapter 7, 1 through 8 gives a little picture of the church on earth, sealed and drawn up in battle formation before the coming struggle. These verses here, 9 all the way through 17, show the church after the battle triumphant in heaven. So this is a portrait by John of the church after the Great Tribulation in heaven. And what does that look like? What are they doing? They're worshiping. Salvation belongs to our God who is seated on the throne and to the Lamb. And who's doing that? Who's involved in that worship service? This great multitude that no one can count, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne. So this phrase, the multitude that no one can count, is John's elaboration of a number that he's given earlier in the first part of chapter 7, the 144,000, and now he's making it clear it's not just 144,000. This is the multitude that no one can count. It's a huge number of people. That phrase echoes the promise of God to the patriarchs that their descendants would be innumerable, as innumerable as the grains of the sand or the stars of the sky. So these promises made to Abraham now are fulfilled in heaven. So the arc of the storyline is coming to a close here. This is the picture that we're getting in heaven. From every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, parallels a list earlier in Revelation. Nation, the word nation echoes the promise to the patriarchs again. You'll be the father of many nations. Tribes brings in the phrase all tribes of Israel from earlier in chapter 7. So basically you've got Jews and Gentiles being portrayed as coming together in this heavenly, uncountable worship service. In addition, every nation continues to stress in the book of Revelation on God's universal care for all the nations. So you can just kind of follow that phrase or that word throughout the book of Revelation. What is God concerned about, or who is God concerned about in the book of Revelation? All nations, every nation, all people. So the closing picture of worship, or one of the closing pictures of worship in the Bible, the image toward which I think all of Scripture is moving and pointing is this one. All peoples from all nations, every tribe, every tongue, gathered together in worship of Christ and God. Salvation belongs to our God. And so you take a text like that then and you begin to ask, well, okay, what kind of beliefs and practices might lead us toward that center? So here's a proposal, okay? What if we considered this as a centering doctrine? Worship is an act of multicultural hospitality in which practices from every nation, tribe, people, and language are embraced as a way of living into the eschatological goal of worship being a space for people of every nation, tribe, people, and language. So let's imagine this text as a centering text. And this possibly is a centering doctrine. Worship is an act of multicultural hospitality in which practices from every nation, tribe, people, and language are embraced as a way of living into the eschatological goal of worship being a space for people of every nation, tribe, people, and language. Okay, let's just read one quote and respond to it, and then we'll have to wrap things up for this morning. Okay, so what follows are a series of quotes from an author who just spends some time considering, especially this text, Revelation 7, as a centering text. Sandra Maria van Opstal, The Next Worship, Glorifying God in a Diverse World. So in the foreword to that book, an author named Mark Laberton says this: all of this means worship should be fundamentally disruptive. If our experiences of worship, particularly corporate worship, are doing their work, they will draw us toward God, toward our God of forgiving, transforming love, even as they draw us away from lives of absorbing self-interest and preoccupation. As those who know we are to seek first the kingdom of God, we gradually abandon the kingdom of self. The evidence of this transformative process is that our neighbor, no mere mortal, as C.S. Lewis says, becomes ever more vividly and consequentially present and urgent in our lives. So it would be impossible to say we love God and not love our neighbor. Faithful worship inevitably leads us to this and makes this dual reality plain. So Mark Laberton's arguing that worship, corporate worship, should be disruptive in the sense that one of the results is that we become more aware of and concerned for our neighbor. And in the light of Revelation 7, perhaps our neighbors of other ethnicities, our multicultural neighbors. Okay. Yeah, I think we should stop there because we've got to put all these tables up, get the chairs up. Okay, so we're going to come back to this and talk a little bit next week about multicultural worship, about Revelation 7, and continue the conversation around instrumental music as well. All right. Thank you so much.
I'm gonna collect all these back up. Not next week.
If anybody leaves them, yeah, that would be great.